Regardless of one's faith, there is always the quiet assurance that God is still on the throne. He's still in control. He's sovereign. Revelation chapter 1 verse 18. I am the living one. I hold the keys to death and Hades, Jesus says. And if you're imprisoned in some circumstance, the only thing that really matters is who holds the key to open the prison doors. Ephesians chapter 1 verse 11. God works out everything in conformity with the purpose of His will. Romans 8:28. He works everything for good according to His purposes. The problem is when we don't get what we want when we want it. That's the key point where we walk out on God, His church. And it's because we're so conditioned with our affluence here in Australia to have everything instantly granted to us. And that affluence is toxic to our spirituality, just as God said it would be when the Israelites were on the other side of Jordan, about to go, and I think it's in Deuteronomy 6, where he warns them. He says, you're going to go into the land of milk and honey, you're going to get fat and rich, and you'll forget all about the Lord your God, and I'm going to have to come and slap you around a bit. That's a Robinson paraphrase. But that, in fact, is what happened, and probably what needs to happen in our nation here to bring us back to dependence upon Him. Because following the trends of our culture, we have created a consumer God in our own image. And we expect Him, and it's preached. You come to Jesus, and He'll make you healthy, wealthy, and wise. All your troubles will be over. Rubbish! Your troubles will just begin. Read what He says to expect. We take that verse, Romans 8:28, that God does everything for good. Therefore, He's going to do that which is good for me. Oh, yes. But what does the word mean? When you read on into the second letter of Corinthians in chapter 1 and 4 and 11, Paul gives us the list of the terrible, atrocious things which happened to him. The abuse, the beatings, the shipwreck, the jailing, the flogging, all of these, it just goes on and on and on. And then he says, and all these things happen for our good, that we might learn to depend upon God. There's the good. And He will often get our attention through what we regard as bad, far more than through the good, or what we regard as good. Revelation chapter 1 verse 9. John was on the Isle of Patmos. Why? Exiled there all alone. Why? Because of the word of God. That's the reward. Good boy, John. You're faithful in preaching the word. Here's your reward. Out there. And in our lives, that's Margaret and I, there have been times when we've lost all of our possessions, we've lost children, we've lived through wars and revolutions, floods, we've been refugees, we've had assaults and abuse and frequent hatred, all that sort of thing. But God uses those things to form us into the image of Jesus that He wants us to become. And through this we learn, number 6, perseverance. Hebrews chapter 10 verse 36, it says, do not throw away your confidence, for it will be richly rewarded. Don't throw it away. Will you remember, God is not obliged to meet whatever you think His convictions or connections or commitments are. He's not obliged to pay all the bills by June 30th as the financial year and the ATO demands of us. He works in a totally different time scale. Psalm 90 verse 4, 1,000 years is in your sight, in your sight is like a day. 1 Peter 3:8. With you, 1,000 years is as a day, or a day is like 1,000 years. Well, for us, a day is often like 1,000 years. In other words, God is not bound into our time zones. Consider Joseph. The key to, you know the story, I don't have to repeat it. But it sums up what God was doing in Joseph's life to fulfill the vision, the dreams that Joseph had. Psalm 105 verses 16 to 22. God sent a man, Joseph, sold as a slave. They bruised his feet with shackles. His neck was put in irons till the word of the Lord proved him to be true. And that little exercise cost him only 13 years in a dirty, stinking, rotten, hot Egyptian dungeon. Till the word of the Lord proved him to be true. And only then did he get over being this stupid, young, impetuous youth he was, boasting to his brothers. Then he had developed to where he could become second in the whole of Egypt under Pharaoh. And God prepared him in that way. Remember this, that between the dream and the diadem, there is often the dungeon. Even though we don't like the dungeon. Sorry, folks. It's there. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12. If we endure, we shall reign with Jesus. There it is again. If we endure, we shall reign with Jesus. These things shouldn't surprise us. When Jesus sent out his first disciples in Matthew chapter 10, verse 26, I'm sending you out as sheep among wolves. And what does a wolf do anytime it can catch a sheep? It attacks it. It tears it apart. It kills it. And Jesus is sending us out into that same environment. Yes, you'll get knocked down in ministry. But success only comes to those who get up after being knocked down again and again and again, and you get up once more. As I mentioned before, in the country to which we went, it was 12 years before we saw the first fellowship formed. Wow, historic breakthrough. And then year 14, God calls us out. Of course, by then things are rolling along very nicely. It calls me back to a work down there in Melbourne. Well, that only took 25 years. Someone mentioned before, must have been one of the pastors, mentioned the book Moths and Miracles. That's sold over 100,000 copies around the world. But that was 30 years of research and 4 years of writing. I'm doing the sequel at the moment. That's only 20 years of research. It'll take me another 3 or 4 years to write it. Number 7. Remember this. You're only a servant. In ministry, you're only a servant. Think of leadership not in the way the corporate sector does, which is a pyramid, hierarchical type of structure, and the leader is the guy who sits in the top of the pinnacle up there. He's climbed the greasy pole at everyone else's expense. But leadership in the Christian context, I find that more helpful to think of it as horizontal. And the leader is simply someone out in front. You're not a leader, of course, unless someone is following you. And if one of those people passes you, well, you're no longer the leader. So you've got to keep growing and moving if you're going to remain a leader in whatever ministry God is calling you to. But you're out there in front, and some people are following. No matter how high you might go, never forget that you're still only a servant. If Satan cannot pull you down from the ladder that you're climbing, then he'll push you up and spill you over the other side. And the higher you go, the greater the distance you may fall.